Yeah, I liked your story, but the thing with the parrot didn't really make sense and it kind of ruined the story for me. Have you dug yourself into a hole? A plot hole? Well, it's time to get out of it. But if you're not new here, you might know that I'm a fan of planning your stories beforehand so that they actually make sense. So a loyal follower of the Protagonist Craft channel might not have this problem to begin with. But hey, maybe you already wrote your story and realized that something didn't make sense, and I'm not here to judge, I'm here to help. If you'd like more help with writing great stories, you should subscribe to Protagonist Crafts, which is this channel that you're watching now. Do it. Do it now. Also, if you're not new here, you might be wondering, what does she have in her hands this time? And the answer is a magnifying glass for some reason. I need something in my hands, otherwise I don't know what to do. Alright. By the way, as you're watching this video, you don't necessarily have to take notes, because you can also get the Plot Without Holes workbook from my Etsy shop. Alright, bestie, are you ready? So what is a plot hole? Well, when something happens in your story that doesn't make sense within that story, you've got a plot hole. The great news is that you can make anything make sense. You're the writer and you've got the responsibility of the world that you created, with one notable exception that we'll talk about later. What isn't a plot hole is when a reader or, the movie watcher disagrees with something that happens there. Like, maybe it was different when it happened to them, or maybe he wouldn't do that, or maybe he just got a different experience. Plot holes are not subjective, alright. Now this was about AI and writing, but I really wanted to include it here. And a while ago I got this comment on one of my posts that this person, they don't use AI to write their stories, of course. They just use it to sort of brainstorm events and to make sure that what she writes makes sense considering what we know about psychology today. And that definitely goes in the top 5 silliest things that I've ever heard about writing. Even just psychologically speaking, there's no way to predict how a person would act in any given situation, and your readers definitely won't be like, oh yes, I know this and this psychological theory, I know what is going to happen. No, they're also not going to be like, no, that goes against everything I know about psychology, that doesn't make sense. Well, no, actually somebody might do that, but they are misguided. Over a long period of time, a person's personality might give some indication or show some kind of a trend for how they act and what kind of choices they make. But in a single situation, there are so many variables that you need to consider that you can't be like, oh yes, psychology, this is what's going to make this thing make sense. No, you're the writer of the story and you make it make sense. Whether or not the things that happen in your story are congruent with the real world, the evidence, the reason, the proof of it needs to be found on your page. I mean, on your story, on the page, in your story. Prepositions, they're very difficult. So what are your characters like as people, and what kind of environments do they live in? What is their culture like? What kind of laws are there? What kind of beliefs do they have? What did someone tell them to do yesterday? Even if it goes against their beliefs, what kind of a motivation do they have to act against their beliefs or what they know that is right? Did they just forget? Do they have ADHD? There are so many reasons for why someone might act a certain way or why something might happen that you can't predict it with any sorts of theory or anything else. There are so many things that affect people and events, and when you're writing a story, you are responsible for those things. And no, you don't need to over-explain it, and you don't need to hammer it in. Don't write for idiots, all right? Somebody reading it will miss something and, they'll be like, nah, but I wouldn't do that. Oh, I just don't get it, why it makes sense. Like, someone definitely can miss something that you wrote, but you don't need to be like, this is why, here is why. Just have it on the page somewhere so you can have something to point out, like, this is the reason why this happened. So when you've got a plot hole in your story, there are 2 possible reasons for why it happened. So reason number 1, maybe you just didn't consider the full implications of something or how something could be done or what would need to happen before something else can happen. But also the other reason is that you know perfectly well what happened, what the backstory is of something, how something works, but you just kind of forgot to mention it it's not in the actual story. Maybe you accidentally cut it out, when you cut out those 5 scenes during editing. And when you're not doing all this work, you don't necessarily end up with like a full plot hole. You might just have like illogical character developments, or just something that makes a reader go, I'm not buying that, but okay, I guess. Something like that could also come from like writing about a situation that you don't personally have like experience with, so that you don't know how people would feel or how they would act. Or maybe you are writing about a situation you were in, but you didn't fully understand why things happened the way they did, or like why you were acting the way you did. So really, having some life experience, it goes a long way. But it also helps to read stuff like memoirs, magazine articles, Reddit threads, eavesdropping, stuff like that. Get to know people and just learn about what they've been doing, what they've done, how they felt, why did they do that. It's just immensely helpful for writing stories in general. And when you find that dreaded plot hole in your story, you have 3 ways of fixing it. So first is the obvious one, that you change the plot event to something else that actually makes sense within your story, or you just make some kind of adjustments to it. The second way to fix a plot event is to change the character that it happens to, or makes it happen. So you can change them as a person somehow, so that it would make more sense that this specific kind of person would do it, or it would happen to. Or you can change their personal history somehow, either within that story or like in their past that happened before the story, so that you can be like, oh yes, they have robbed a bank before, therefore this makes perfect sense. But also you could change your story's world, so you could change the setting somehow, but you could also change past events and stuff that has already happened, that can be like, oh yes, well, this kind of thing has happened before, therefore it makes sense that it could happen again. And like I said before, the evidence of it making sense, it needs to be found on the page in your story, in writing somehow. Sometimes it can be just like heavily implied, but it still needs to be there. And sometimes all you'd have to do might just be remember to mention something beforehand, just like casually have it there, so that afterwards your readers can be like, oh, that was significant, I had no idea. I also have a video on how to write a plot twist, so you might want to watch that one as well. So to write a story that actually makes sense, you'd have to consider these questions from the get-go, and regarding your protagonist and their big problem, also known as the main conflict of your story. Why is this problem a problem for this character in particular? And here's a little hint, you need to look at their flaws. Would this problem really happen in this world? And what set it in motion? And why doesn't this character just walk away from it? Why is it any business of theirs that this is happening? And those are foundational things that your story's entire believability is hanging on. So just make sure you get the answers for them, all right? And because there's a problem in your story, there also needs to be a solution. If the solution is obvious to your readers, what are the reasons that your character doesn't have the solution straight away? The problem is a problem precisely because there isn't an immediate answer to it. So what are the reasons that this character don't have access to the solution straight away? Why can't they see it? Or if they know what the solution is, what is standing in the way and why? How does the character eventually come to the right solution? So what kind of information or skills do they need, or what kind of transformation do they need to go through? And how is it believable that this character, who in the beginning was so unequipped to solving this problem, that they actually eventually ended up with the right solution? What kind of potential was there? I would dare say that most plot holes are related to the big problem and how it gets solved. But besides your overall plot, you also need to be looking at your scenes. So does any scene goal make sense considering what your character most wants in the story, which is solving the big problem? And when there's some kind of an obstacle, as there more often than not should be, is it actually rooted in the story, or does it come out of nowhere and it's not explained even later? That is a very big no-no. Nothing should be coming out of nowhere. Even if it seems like it at the time, there needs to be some kind of reason there. It needs to be rooted in your story's world. And then when there are problems, your character is reacting to them. Is the reaction proportional? Does it make sense considering what this character is like? And then when they decide to do something else, this didn't work, they need to, make a decision of what to do next. Does that make sense considering your story's world? and your character. You don't need to agree with your character about how this problem should be solved, and your readers don't need to agree with them either. And there are so many questions you should be asking about your story, and you can find them all in the Plot Without Holes workbook. You can find it on Writer Lifestyle on Etsy, and if you buy 2 more things at once, you automatically get 20% off. You're welcome. Well, let's take a closer look at plot holes and figure out what might have gone wrong there. So when you're writing a story, first of all, you need to remember setups and payoffs. You've probably already heard of Chekhov's gun, so you know that if there is a gun hanging on the wall, somebody needs to be shooting it, which means that every element in your story, it needs to be relevant somehow or it needs to go. But it's useful for plotting as well. So you need to also remember that all the shots in your story need to be coming out of loaded guns. Let's have a silly little example that I totally made up because, you know, all stories are made up. So let's say that Susan is always bickering with her neighbor about respectful behavior, about boundaries. The neighbor is noisy and his pets, they're always on Susan's yard, just nibbling away on her prize-winning cabbages. Susan is left to deal with this on her own because her husband is often away on hunting trips. In the beginning of the story, we also see Susan slip a lacy thong in her sleazy co-worker's car so that he'll get in trouble with his wife. And we also see her yelling at people on traffic because they're just too slow and she wants to go home. So we have now seen these things. Susan has a reason to dislike her neighbor. She's home alone a lot. She has access to guns, and this is implied with hunting, so you don't necessarily have to even mention a gun. And Susan is definitely capable of doing, let's say, questionable things just to get people act the way that they should be acting. And also, she might just have some anger issues. So knowing this, it makes perfect sense when Susan later on goes and gets one of her husband's guns, goes to her front yard where the rabbits are, shoots one of the neighbor's pet rabbits, and then leaves it on his porch just to make a statement. No plot hole there, it was all set up perfectly. Of course, there will be a lot of things happening, like in between these two things, but when things escalate, they do need to start from somewhere, and you need to be showing the potential as early as possible. And the first 10-ish pages of your story, they have a lot of responsibility for setting up your story and for making it believable and plot hole free. The setups and payoffs are not the only pair of friends that you need to remember, because you also need to remember cause and effect. Anything that happens in your story, it needs to have a cause somewhere in the past, and then there needs to be consequences. What the consequences are, once again, it depends on your story and the world that you have created. So when Susan shoots the rabbit and there are 0 consequences and nothing happens, then yeah, that definitely sounds like a plot hole. I mean, will the neighbor call the police? Will he move? Will he retaliate somehow? I don't know, but it needs to be something. And Susan definitely had cause to act out this act of violence, even if we, don't agree with it, because she doesn't like the neighbor is disrespectful, and again, she is known to solve things in a very unique way. So as you can see, what your characters are like, it plays a big role on making your plot make sense. But you don't only need to be thinking about what the character is like in the beginning when they're hit with a big problem. You also need to think of what they will become like at the end of the story, because of all the events in the story, to become the kind of person who can solve the problem. You need to orchestrate the right kinds of events, but you also need to be dropping hints of the change as it's happening, because it can't happen like in 1 second, all right? So to make it believable, you need to be showing how they're changing, in addition to having the right kinds of events who will change this person in the right kind of way. And we don't need to know in the beginning what this character will be like at the end. And when we were talking about the solution to the problem, the solution doesn't have to be obvious to your readers. Like, yes, definitely everyone will have opinions on how any given problem should be solved, but just like have a little think of like, what is the obvious solution, and could your actual solution be something different? But again, there are many questions like this about your story in the Plot Without Holes workbook. And finally, let's talk about the one thing you might not be able to get around when you're writing your story and creating your story world, which is the real world. Whether you're writing about the past or present day, about your country or a different country, you can't escape laws of physics, for example, or like what kind of things were accessible to people at that time, or like in that country, what would likely happen there considering the culture, for example. The weather, what's the weather like? For example, if you were writing about the past, you could very quickly run yourself into a plot hole if your characters were traveling all too fast. Like if you were writing about the 1700s and then your characters were like at this end of the country and then they were at the other end of the country the next day, you might just have a plot hole there unless you were writing about like Liechtenstein or Belgium, you know. And if you were writing about a country that you're not so familiar with, again, travel as an example, it might lead into plot holes. For example, like if I was writing about, well, not me, if somebody was writing about the United States, and, you know, even if it was about present day, you can't drive from one end of the country to the other in like 1 or 2 days. You would need multiple days. Or using something else as an example, if you were an American writing about Finland and then your character went bankrupt because of their like medical bills, they ended up at the ICU and then they just had so much medical debt that they needed to, you know, start selling drugs. That's not a thing that happens here, all right? So that would be a very big plot hole. So your setting, it does have some limitations there, so consider that. And if you're unsure about your research or you just don't want to do a lot of research, then don't have your plot depend on something about the setting. So, you know, traveling across long distances, for example, or stuff like that. So if you're not willing or ready to do the research, then that's fine. It's not as much of a big deal if there's something there that makes a reader go like, no, actually that's inaccurate, or whatever. But if your whole plot is depending on this thing, then you do need to do your research. And you don't necessarily need to be writing about a different country or a different time if you just don't know how gravity works. So now we have finally got you out of your plot hole, and once again you can find the Plot Without Holes workbook in my Etsy shop. And next you might want to watch this video that is all about how to plot your story.